Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Cyclonic Thrift Podcast, a series focusing on deck building, card analysis, and financial speculation, all through the eyes of a Commander player on a budget. I'm one of your hosts, Christian, joined as always by
Zach. Welcome, everyone.
And we're happy to have each and every one of you as we wrap up our final episode of our analysis of a budget environment mini-series. On this episode, we'll be analyzing the Playgroup. So if you haven't listened to the other two episodes, go ahead and pause, jump back to those, and give them a listen. First episode, we talked about what makes a commander, how do you choose a commander. In the second episode, we talked about what makes the deck, what components are there, what elements, where should your budget go, all of those things. So now we're going to take a look at how a play group looks in this budget environment with everything we've talked about. With each of the decks running, this much kind of value, the different archetypes and budget you see more frequently, what kind of commanders you can expect, what does all of that look like coming together? And that would be your play group or the meta of your play group. And we're going to just analyze ours as an example, because obviously we've been playing in it for probably close to 4 years now in this budget format, 5 years maybe. And we play pretty frequently. I think our average is like once a week, one single game a week on average, is what it came down to. So we play a lot of Magic. So with that in mind, we're gonna jump into we're breaking down our play group. We did a lot of analytics for this, a lot of statistics, a lot of just numbers and looking at most played cards and things like that. Zach did all the heavy lifting on that, so appreciate that. And with that, then we're gonna go ahead and jump into the overall play group, the decks themselves, how many are there, and the colors of those decks. So Zach, take us away.
Yep, so like Christian said, the first thing we'll jump into is just the overall statistics. So the first thing we wanted to point out is that overall in the playgroup we have 37 different decks, all with different commanders, and that's across 7 people in the playgroup. As far as the color breakdown of commanders, we have 8 decks that are monocolored, so that makes up 21.6% of all the decks in the playgroup. We have 18 that are 2 colors. So that's 48.7% of decks in the group. And then 3 color is 11 decks, making up 29.7%. And right now, we don't have any 4 or 5 color in the playgroup, so that accounts for the entire color breakdown there.
Yep. So looking at these breakdowns, Zach, what does this tell us about the play group in these numbers?
Well, obviously, we favor 2 color pretty heavily. Makes up
Mm-hmm.
pretty much half of the playgroup, which is not too surprising in my opinion. I mean, I think 2 color is kind of optimal for budget, just because you don't have to worry about color fixing quite as much as the 3 color, but you get access to 2 colors, which is,
Mm-hmm.
I think, generally more powerful than monocolored deck.
Yeah, I think the majority of it is based on the budget factor. I think you're kind of like me, Zach, where you put in lands that make sure your colors are there, but you don't spend the extra budget on your lands that could enter untapped as often as maybe we should, arguably. But you only have $50 to work with. I think we're both kind of in the thought of putting it into our value and our removal and our card draw and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, just not having access to great lands and color fixing, or at least having the budget to gain access to those, I think is what kind of lessens the amount of 3 color. And then monocolor, that's a arguably entirely different reason. For me, I don't know about you, you can explain your thing. It's I do like some of the flavor of monocolor, but it can feel a bit bland just sitting in one color for a whole game. And like you said, just having access to 2 feels better, is better. Not every color has everything you need. So I guess it's more of an obvious one. But yeah, for me, it's just kind of boring playing in the same color all game for a whole deck, and building it is also kind of boring personally.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, when I'm building and even playing, I like the idea that you can kind of reach into these different colors for, the different things that they do. Like you said, like if I, wanted to build a Simic deck, I'm gonna have a bunch of green ramp. I'm gonna have, whatever the other component is in blue as far as like, spell slinging kind of stuff, counter spells,
Mhm.
anything like that. I like that kind of distinction between the two and how you can combine those to get a different effect than you would be able to get if you had either of those single colors.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it is pretty much self-explanatory in terms of just why we
Mhm.
don't play as much monocolor, but I guess it's good to just really say, if you sit down and build a mono, I'll just say mono green, like I was gonna. If you're gonna build a mono green deck, you know you're gonna be ramping. Odds are you are going to go hard into green's color identity. You're probably ramping and just letting big creatures, but
Mhm.
you're not getting the same things as you would in a green blue deck where you can copy stuff. There's probably a little bit more spell slinging, there's gaining control of stuff, and then just straight blue things like raw card draw and counter spells and stuff like that. So it's just it feels a little bit more one line, one track, one trick pony when you're in monocolor, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there are colors like red and white that are generally just weaker as a
Mhm.
monocolor than say like blue, green, or black.
Yeah, those 2 feel more of a splashy kinda color than
Yeah.
a main lead, I guess. So yeah, that's our breakdown. 37 decks across 7 members, primarily 2 color, and then mono and 3 are pretty close. But speaking of white, we're gonna jump into the playgroup colors. Um, and talk about, what decks are what colors, how many of each, the commanders that have those colors. We're going to go in Wooburg order, and sort of starting with white. Take us in, Zach.
Yeah, so there are 11 total decks with white in them in our playgroup, making up 29.7% of all the decks. And among the decks where white is present, Nizan Revered Bladesmith includes the most, with 62.79% of the deck being white. And Edgar Markov includes the least, with 15.05% of the deck being white. And as far as the average presence of white in decks that include the color, overall, the amount of white cards is 36.54% of the deck, so just over a third. And so the most popular card overall in white is, it's not too surprising to me, was Swords of Plowshares.
Yeah.
I'll go ahead and read that. Uh, 1 white for an instant, exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. Hmm. Yeah, this card is definitely a staple in our playgroup overall. Just very efficient removal.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, when I was looking at these numbers, they honestly felt kind of where I expected white to be, I guess. Um, out of 37 decks, 11 of them have white. That's pretty believable. The deck that has the most white in it is one of my decks, Nazan, Zach said. Um, It's a Voltron deck, a lot of caring about equipment, um, and that's just kind of what White does, cares about equipment a good bit. So, kind of makes sense for him. And the average presence of White felt pretty accurate to me. And I feel like decks that are running White, again, we just mentioned it's kind of splash color, so about a third of the deck being white when white is in the deck, that feels right too. I wasn't surprised by these stats, I guess, Zach.
Yeah, the only thing I would say that surprised me a little bit was the first statistic we said, which is 11 of the 37 decks include white.
Hmm.
I guess just because I don't run much white at all on any of my decks, I was a little bit surprised that, almost a third of our decks had white in them. But
Yeah.
but yeah, other than that, I think, with as far as like the average presence of white in the decks being just over a third, I think that makes sense. Like you said, it feels
Hmm.
like more of a splash color for the efficient removal, and then some of our Voltron decks with auras and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think I don't know for sure this statistic, but I would imagine that the majority of decks that white shows up in is probably a three color deck, honestly. And that probably contributes to, I mean, our deck that has white in it that has it the least is Edgar. That's a three color deck. That's Mardu colors. I know Tuvasa's three color with white. Zura's three color with white. So, maybe that speaks a little bit more to the fact that, white really is a splash color because you have, you could say a blue or, a black white deck. well, instead you're going to do three color because white just wasn't enough. The blue black is what's there, and then you're splashing white, I guess. You could look at it that way. Um, Historically, white is not very good in Magic. If you're a new player, you may not know that. It's just been a color. Its identity is a little weak. It doesn't really do a lot of powerful things. Sometimes it does. It's not. That's not always true. It's gotten a lot better in recent years. I mean, obviously, as you can see, Swords of Plowshares is a. It's been a staple card in all of Magic, really, for years. Primarily Commander, because it's just like Zach said, efficient. Um, but other than those, one in every couple sets, white doesn't really get a lot of great things, except for recently they've been trying to push, I think, trying to push in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely been like better draw and ramp for white
Hmm.
recently.
Yeah, so we'll see what the future of white is, and if it keeps getting better, or if it kind of falls off again. We'll see. I hope it gets better because there are some decks and commanders I like that have white in them. I'd like to play, but not that I'm turned away from it just because I don't want to play white, but I'd like to see the color offer more in terms of deck building than it does now at times.
Mhm.
All right, so jumping into blue, um, out of the 37 decks in the playgroup, 21 of them are blue. That means over half, at 56.7% of all decks, include blue. Among the decks where blue is present, Brago King Eternal includes the most at 76.7%. Tuvasa the Sunlit includes at least 24 point, at the least contains 24.10%. The average presence of blue in decks that include it is 52.3%. And our most played blue card across all decks is Brainstorm. Brainstorm is an instant for 1 blue mana that says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So, what does all this tell you, Zach?
Yeah, so obviously blue in the decks where it's in makes up a much larger percentage of the deck than white. Uh, over half of the deck, which I think is interesting. I think it makes sense
Hmm.
because blue is, like I said, white is not the most powerful color in Magic right now and hasn't been, statistically. Whereas blue is one of the more powerful colors, I would say. Green and blue, in my opinion, are the two
Hmm.
most powerful, generally
They
speaking.
are. I think so
And
too.
yeah, and you get access to things like counter spells and stuff like that. And I think there's just a lot of efficient card draw, counter magics, and that kind of stuff that a lot of our decks include because it's just a necessity to run things like that are going to allow you to interact with other people, even if that's not the overall goal of your deck. I think there's just a lot of utility in this color, and it ends up uh, adding quite a few cards to the deck that might not otherwise be there if you weren't playing blue.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I'm.
but
Yeah, for sure. That's a good way to put it. I think blue comes into it with so many staples that if you're in the color, you just throw it in automatically. Like if you're
mhm,
playing blue, you're going to bring spell. Like you're just
yep,
there's almost no way you don't because the fact it gives you access to it in blue, you just do it because it's so good. Brainstorm obviously is another one of those cards where it's like if you're in blue, you
yep,
probably just bring Brainstorm because it's insane.
yeah.
Um,
Treasure Cruise.
yeah, Treasure Cruise is another great staple. In non-budget, Cyclonic Thrift or
Yeah.
Cyclonic Rift, but Cyclonic Thrift, of course. Uh, you just bring that.
Yep.
Um, there's just so many cards in blue that break the game or just unfair, just so good that when you say I'm going to splash blue, I'm going to bring blue, you're bringing this whole package of cards automatically in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as Brainstorm being the most popular, like Christian and I talked about this a good bit. It's like, we were kind of surprised, I think, by Brainstorm being the most
Hmm.
popular blue card, but at the same time, I think,
Makes
uh,
sense.
yeah, it makes sense. Like what I said to Christian was just you never feel bad casting Brainstorm. It's just efficient, lets you dig a little bit. Maybe get your land if you're short land drops early in the game. Just dig through your top deck a little bit. Just nice to have.
Yeah, and another thing is that it's cheap in terms of budget. It's been printed so many times that it's completely reasonably priced for our format. So that just helps it all the more show up in these decks. over half the decks have blue in it. I mean, the color is extremely strong, so I guess I'm not surprised by that again. And I think it's also partially just the nature of our playgroup. You know, like you and a couple other guys, you joke and call them blue mages, but they like to counter things. They like to control things. They like to draw a lot of cards, and I think that's part of it. You know, I like blue a lot too. I'm a green player, um, but I think there's less of people like me in the playgroup than there are the blue mages, as it were. Um, Yeah. Also, this is worth mentioning. We didn't mention in white, but our talking about our the decks that have blue most present. We didn't include monocolored decks because that kind of skews the information. And it's obvious if a monocolored deck is mostly blue because that's all it can have. So yeah, Brago, like we said, is the most, which a very controlly deck, fairly stacksy deck, arguably. A lot of drawing cards, so that makes sense. And then Tuvasa is a Voltron deck, with only a quarter of it being blue. I think most of that's control and a couple, Aqueous form type effects, but more than likely that deck's mostly white and green for the different auras on it. I think anything else you want to add to blue, Zach?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right, cool. I'll take us into black. And we'll be looking at the number of decks in the play group, and that's 16 out of the 37. Meaning black makes up, or is can yes, meaning 43.2% of all decks include black, so almost half. Also, fairly not surprising, I guess. Maybe a little bit higher than expected, but that's probably right. Like we talked about the power level of black. Among the decks where black is present, Edgar Markov includes the most at 68.2%, and Anala Archmage Ritualist includes the least at 15.91%. The average presence of black in decks that include the color is 40.15%. And our most played black card is Diabolic Tutor, which says 2 black for a sorcery. Search your library for a card and put that card in your hand, then shuffle your library. Now, Zach, before we get into the numbers, I know you are iffy on this card. Let's discuss Diabolic Tutor.
Or so, for me, I recognize that it's a good card. I feel bad, uh, paying 4 mana for just tutoring for a card. I mean, obviously it's good, but there are just other things I'd rather do. I'd rather be kind of like digging through the deck. Normally, a lot of my decks are focused a lot on card drawing, so I'd rather just dig that way most of the time than hardcast Diabolic Tutor. But obviously, I recognize it's a powerful card. Just,
Right, yeah, and I don't think Zach's wrong. I mean, I think this was the most played black card by not a lot, and it wasn't that much either. I could be wrong, but I don't think it was like 30 decks ran this, and then the next card was like 5 decks or something. I think this was only in like 7 decks or something of the 16. Um, and I know what you're saying. The thing about it is there's just no tutors in our budget format, other than ones that are they specifically work because of the deck. Like we talked about Mausoleum Secrets, I think, on the last episode. That card is great, but it only works in a graveyard based deck because you need to fill it with creatures to do anything with it. Whereas any black deck, you can throw this in, pay for it to get whatever you want out, and you have it. It's just almost forced. If you're going to want a tutor, you're forced to use this one because all the others are either too specific, unless you're playing in that specific deck, or you just don't play it at all, I guess. So yeah. Anyway, beyond Diabolic Tutor, digging into the stats a bit more, 43% of all decks. What do you think, Zach? Does that surprise you, or does that feel about right?
I think that feels about right. We do have a fair share of like graveyard decks, which
Mm-hmm.
obviously black is going to be included in that pretty much every time. I was a little bit surprised about the last stat with black making up on average 40% of the deck that it's in,
Yeah.
because I guess maybe it's just my decks, but like Yarok, I pretty much just splash black. I think it makes up a pretty small percentage. I wasn't too surprised about it now. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That would be low in that deck since it's a lot of like wizards and spell slinging and stuff like that. Whereas black doesn't do too much of that.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree with the 40%. I mean, 40% is a lot. Like obviously blue is over half, but it's blue. Black being almost half is, I guess, kind of surprising. There are black does kind of bring that handful of premier cards with it, like blue. Good removal, good draw, all that stuff.
Yeah,
I
sack outwards.
Sack outlets, yeah, that's another thing. I think a big part of it is if you are playing a black with deck, if you are playing a deck with black in it, odds are the commander is pushing you towards a mostly black archetype or play style or deck type. I feel like Marin that I have is black green, but it is very very black compared to green in terms of what it's trying to do. Edgar Markov is black, red, white. Came up most deck with black in it. Very very black. You just a lot of vampires are black. A lot of the removal is going to be black. So I feel like odds are for commanders black most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it's going to push you towards some type of more black identity uh, effect. So that might be why it comes up so much. I'm not sure. Um,
Yeah.
but that's just my guess based on this information. That's the best I could give you.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thinking about it, like Shirei obviously really
Yeah.
pushes you toward a black identity. Even Corvold to probably a lesser extent, but still, you care about sacrificing things. That's a largely black effect. So I think that makes sense.
Yeah. And, that's just speculation based on the information I don't know. We have a lot of decks and there's a lot of information to look at. So, yeah, just a guess. Anything else you want to add to Black Zach? If not, take us into red.
Yeah, I think that about sums it up for black. So I'll jump into red here. So for red, there are 13 of our 37 decks that contain red, so that's 35.1% of all our decks. And among decks that have red, the deck with the most red is Winota Joiner of Forces with 43.33% being red, and the least is Corvold Fakehurst King, which includes only 11.94% of red. And then the average presence of red in decks that include the color is 29.8%. And for our most played red card, we have Thrill of Possibility, which is one in a red for an instant. And it reads as an additional cost to cast a spell, discard a card, and draw two cards. So I'm not too surprised that the most popular red card is Thrill of Possibility. I think that makes sense. Uh, the funny thing is this card, I think red out of all the colors, I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, but thinking back to when we were kind of going through and figuring all this out, I think red had the biggest spread as far as Thrill of Possibility didn't win out by that much. I think there were like 6 or 7 decks that ran Thrill of Possibility, and then there were a bunch of other cards that were like 4 of, 5 of. Uh, so it definitely had a larger spread as far as the most common colors. Whereas like uh, green, for instance, there were only a couple of cards that even got close to like the most popular one. All the ramp spells, there were like 14 or 15 decks that played them, and then a bunch of other cards that were like 4 or 5 different decks played them. So I think that's interesting. Uh,
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think part of that could be through a possibility is still new. It came out last year. So if people haven't upgraded their decks, they might still be. Well, you can run Tormenting Voice and this. I do, but some people might just replace Tormenting Voice with this because it's just better. If they haven't yet, that could be part of it. It's a new card.
yeah,
That and I think a lot of the red cards are a little bit more specific. To what you're doing. You're not going to run every red card in every deck. It has less staples, I think, in this format than it would a competitive. Like you're not going to run Chaos Warp every time. I feel like most higher level deck, not higher level, but less budget or no budget decks are probably running Chaos Warp, stuff like that. And it's out of budget for us, so you see less of those. Um, but Throw Possibility is just so good. You can't not be running it in red. I would argue. Um, it's just probably the premier red draw spell in this format. And I
Mhm.
also think, Zach, that I don't know about you on this. I think you're kind of more in agreement with me, at least now than before, because I think Wizards have been putting out better versions of it. But I know I think at least a lot of our play group is not too into the exile a card from the top of your library until in a turn. You may cast it, or until the end of your next turn, you may cast it or whatever. I don't think a lot of them are into that effect necessarily yet. I used to not like it. It's gotten printed on some better cards. And it's been improved in terms of waiting to the end of your next turn to cast those cards. I actually like the effect now. I didn't used to. My war deck runs several of those, especially because they're copyable. It really is kind of like just drawing cards. And I know a lot of good or more staple red cards are like that. So I'm not sure how you feel about that effect.
Yeah, I think the effect is good. Typically, at least like historically, I would think that would be more of a standard effect. I
Hmm.
definitely remember playing like mono red standard on MTG Arena, and there were quite a few cards in there like that. But I do think, like you said, for stuff like Wart, that's going to be wanting to copy spells and just be able to like maximize value from all their spells. I think it makes sense to run an effect like that. It's definitely more dependent on what you want to be doing and probably what commander you're running.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like a fancy name for that effect. Like there's looting and rummaging or different, ways, just fire breathing. They're like, all these cards have little nicknames for the type of effect. I don't know if there is one for that. If not, there should be because it'd be a little bit more easy to discuss. But yeah, I agree with you. It did feel a little bit more standardy, but since some of the new cards have come out, I've enjoyed it a bit more and haven't been able to copy them. I run some of those effects in oh geez, Grenzo I think has a handful, but generally speaking, yeah, I think it's a fact that's been improved upon. Um, and I think we might see more of those in future red decks in our play group, but we'll see. Um, as for the actual number of decks playing red, 35%, a third, that feels about right, I think. I
Mhm.
don't know about you.
Yeah, I I don't play a lot of red decks. I think my only deck with red right now is Corvold, and obviously that's just splashed in here, so that's the
Right.
lowest one, 11%.
Yeah.
But I think it makes sense overall. We do have a few decks that run it, like Xenagos, Rakdos, and the more battle cruisery type decks that want those big red creatures.
True. Yeah. And with that number, 35.1%, that makes white the least played color in the format now. So, um, I would be surprised if red was less played than white. So I'll say that as well. Um, Beyond that, 29.8% of the decks that have it are running, or that's the average presence of it. That feels right. I think about a third of the deck being red in whatever deck it shows up in is exactly where I expect it to be personally.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Definitely less like staple cards like you talk about than blue
Hmm.
and green, but still, makes up a significant portion.
Yeah, I think exactly. The less staple cards, it again, I feel like red offers a lot of really specific things. That new like her what is it, Harmonic Prodigy came out. It's a good example. It doubles triggers on wizards and shamans. Like that's so specific, but it's so good if you're using those cards.
Yep.
I think red has a lot of cards like that. Um, and I feel like red shows up. We talked about blue kind of just does its thing every time. Red and black, any commanders that have black in it's probably caring about the graveyard a little bit more or caring about a very or black effect. I feel like red shows up in a lot of different ways in terms of decks. Like Wart to Winota, both decks that I have, red is not used the same way at all. Like not even a little bit. Red usually is showing up in my Winota deck probably on a lot of double cards, as in like you know, it's white and red, but it's probably showing up in just like good creatures, pumping effects, double strike effects, all those things. While war is drawing cards, burn, and the exiling off the top, like we talked about. Maybe a little bit of token generation too. Like two very, very different red effects, but it's still red. So, red, even though being one of the weaker colors again, arguably, it does have a nice spread of things it can do in
Mhm.
terms of being a splash color.
Yeah, I agree. And I think looting, like you said, is a big one that it gets splashed in for. But then I also think, and I think you mentioned this too already, is like a lot of the red that people run is stuff that's monocolor, like especially Gruul. I think there are a lot of good creatures and stuff that are Gruul, like Zerta Druid. I think it's a good one where
True.
that's running quite a few decks. I think all of our Gruul decks probably run Zerta Druid.
I
That's
think I think
running.
so.
But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that about sums up red for me. I don't know. You have anything else to add, Zach? If not, we can tackle our last color.
All right. Take us into green then. So of our 37 decks, 16 of them are green. So that's 43.2% of all the decks. And among the decks where green is present, Omnath Locus of Rage includes the most at 75.86%, and Calamax the Storm Siren was the least at 20.65%. And the average presence of decks that include green, or the average presence of green in decks that include green is 43.7%. That's pretty high. Uh,
Yeah.
And then our most played green card is Rampant Growth. So that's one of the green for sorcery. Search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. Not too surprising. I figured, with green would probably be one of the ramp spells, either
Yeah.
Rampant Growth or Cultivate would have been my guesses there.
Hmm. Yeah, I think before anything else, it's worth mentioning that black and green tied in number of decks that include the color, both at 43.2% with 16 decks. And I think that makes sense. Again, we talked about so many blue mages in our play group that green and black being the next best colors coming in tied. I it, it, I'm not surprised by that again. You know, I feel like all this time we've been saying we're not surprised by this. I feel like that demonstrates the fact that a budget environment, you're not losing out on what a normal Magic experience would be like. I think everything kind of stays the same. Maybe some colors go up, some colors go down, some cards you see, some cards you don't see. But generally speaking, you really are still just playing Magic, even though it's budget. So I think that was one of the points you wanted to get across in this analysis is what does budget look like? Well, it doesn't look that much different, and I think all these colors have spoken to that.
Yeah, for sure. Like we have different staples in a lot of cases, and
Hmm.
it's a slightly different meta, but it's still, we're still gonna have our staple cards that you're gonna see in a lot of decks. We're still, gonna it's gonna be the same thing, just on a smaller scale budget wise. Some things just get swapped out for cheaper cards that are
Yeah.
a similar effect.
Yep. Um, looking at another thing I want to look at real quick is that the most played. Omnath at 75.8%. That is crazy. And at first glance, I guess that's like why that's insane. But if you know the commander, basically you get a 5/5 every landfall trigger. So basically, this deck is just running every single possible land tutor it can in green because you get a free 5/5 out of it. So with that in mind, 75% is actually pretty reasonable, especially in budget. I think again, in budget, you just push harder into your game plan. So maybe a competitive Omnath deck is more like 60/40 somewhere in there, 62/40 or 38, something like that. Again, pushing the game plan as hard as possible, 75.8% it is still a lot, but it's a lot more reasonable, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I think that explanation makes perfect sense. Pushing the game plan like we've talked about throughout this mini series is, a lot of our decks we sacrifice a little bit in other areas of deck building to really push that game plan and try to get through our commander's effect and just try to win versus maybe running more interaction, things like that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we're playing commander, so we want to make use of our commanders, and that sounds silly or maybe a little bit, um, you know, you could argue that makes the deck weaker, but we're playing commander because we think the commanders we're choosing are cool. We want to make use of them as best we can, and that's a lot of the fun. So,
Yep.
your Calamax deck is 20.65%. I'm not surprised by that either, just because again, pushing the game plan. You probably are ramping with green, I'm guessing, and everything else is just copy value.
Yeah, exactly. This is it runs quite a few ramp spells. So obviously, that makes up like a fifth of the deck. It looks like, but other than that, pretty much everything else is like burn spells and stuff like that. That's gonna have good copy value.
Mm-hmm. I the average presence is 43.7%. I think this falls in line with, again, blue and green. Maybe that's why they're more powerful colors. One of the reasons, at least. There's just so many state. Like if you're running green, all of your ramp is green. If you're not running green, it's all artifacts probably. But if you're running green, you are automatically throwing in the ramp suite of Cultivate, Ramp and Growth, Kodama's Reach, uh, what Nature's Lore probably, Wood Elves,
Yeah,
Sakura
some
Tribe
Fury
Elder,
Drought, Soccer Tribal,
yeah, Farhaven
even
Elf.
probably Duke, yeah, Dorks, Farhaven Elf, you know, Llanowar Elves, Finehorn Elves, that kind of stuff is running quite a few of our decks.
Yep, exactly. So all of those effects, as soon as you put green in the deck, and again, we talked about last time on this mini series, the last episode, that your portion of your deck needs to be dedicated to ramp for various reasons. If you're running green, you're running the green suite of ramp because it's just the best. It's cheap, it's easy to use, it does it better than anything else. And I think, that automatically adds at least 20% of the deck, like we showed in Calamax. So the rest of the green is going to be your actual, whatever your game plan is, if it includes green. So, 43.7%, almost half, is a pretty reasonable when you think about what green is offering as a color in Commander.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
All right. Is there anything else on any of the colors, Zach, you want to mention before we head into the CMC of the playgroup?
Uh, I think the the colors are interesting just because I think we've really hit on like the strong points of the colors by looking at this breakdown. Like obviously green, we got a ramp card. It makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's very much in the color identity. Red, we've got draw. Black, we've got tutor, which is kind of, I could probably argue that that's not strictly within the color identity of black, but I think still makes sense. And
Mm-hmm.
then brainstorm, spell slinging, blue stuff. I think, I just think it's interesting that we've really kind of hit the color identities on the head in a lot of cases here. And I also think it's interesting that like white and red are the least played colors, and like we've talked about, they're probably the weaker colors in Magic, where stuff like blue and green are making up a much larger percentage of the deck. And I think it makes sense, but it's still interesting to see that breakdown of how it actually turns out in practice versus theory.
Yeah, and I don't know if we actually mentioned this, but I'm gonna make sure it's clear. The cards that we have talked about are not guesses, and they're not cards we like a lot. These are the actual most played cards in each of our in across the decks. Zach, put it together and figured that out um, through spreadsheets, and those are the actual most played cards across all our decks, which is interesting. So this is like real information from a real play group, our play group. So none of this is just guessing. This has all been calculated, which makes it more authentic in terms of wow, okay, so me and my buddies, me and my play group decide let's go budget. This is kind of what we can expect, and it's not obviously strict. You might have a lot more red mages in your play group, and red is no longer at that 35% of decks included. Maybe it goes up to 40, 42%. Um, but I feel like generally our group is pretty aware of the power of colors. They have their identities they like. So I feel like if nothing else, this is a pretty vanilla version of what you would expect in any other playgroup.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, cool. So jumping into the playgroup mana value, which this is a short little section, but we just wanted to put it out there. Zach, you want to take us into this?
Yeah, so we, like Christian said, we wanted to talk about kind of the CMC of decks on the play group. Just at kind of a macro scale, like what's the average CMC of the deck? What's the most played cards in that CMC? So just jump into it. The highest mana value, or the highest average mana value in any deck in our play group is 4.57 with Rakdos, Lord of Riots, where the lowest is 2.57 in Calamax the Stormsire. And across the entire playgroup, the average mana value is 3.16. So obviously up to 4.57 and down to 2.57. And so it's not a huge spread, I'd say, less than
Yeah.
2 mana in either direction,
Hmm.
which is interesting. And since the average mana value across, yeah, the average mana value across the entire playgroup is 3.16, we wanted to point out the most popular 3-drop, which is Cultivate for 2 and a green, search your library for up to 2 base clan cards, reveal them, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other in your hand, and shuffle. Not too surprising that this is the most played 3-drop. I think, it's just a good card, and like we talked about, this and Rampant Growth are like probably the first 2 ramp spells you're going to throw in your deck if you're running green,
Hmm.
so it makes sense.
This information is very interesting. I actually expected the average mana value across the playgroup to be a little bit lower, actually. Um, Maybe I was silly for thinking that, but it was just I feel like a lot of the decks people try as hard as possible to have that low CMC, at least make that 3 mark, because a lot of times if you're drawing cards at 3, 4, 5 mana, you can't be as efficient. Maybe you can't do as much stuff. So keeping as low as possible is ideal. Um, but I guess Zach, we have a good handful of those battle cruisery decks. With Rakdos, Xenagos, Omnath, arguably. Um, there's a lot of those decks that just can cheat. I mean, Winota was higher than I realized she was, but I'm cheating out so much stuff that I don't care as much about CMC of the cards. So, that's what can skew it a little bit, but still 3.16. Were you surprised by that at all, or did you think that's pretty much where you thought it was going to be?
I think that's around what I would have expected personally. I try to shoot for 3 uh, in most of my decks. Just I think, like you said, that's a good spot to be as far as I can usually cast a 3-drop spell whenever a lot of counter spells and instants and stuff fall into that range. I think it's just a good number to shoot for. I think we're if you were to look at average mana value in a non-budget group, it would probably be lower just because you have access to a lot of things like fast mana and stuff like that. That's going to
True.
drag
Yeah,
down that average CMC more than
that's
we have
true.
access to in budget.
I might have been having that kind of mindset as well, because Soul Ring. Not every deck runs Soul Ring in our playgroup just because of the price, and I
Yeah.
think almost everyone tries to get it in there. I typically put it in there at the start, and if it comes down to it, I'll cut it. It
Yeah.
doesn't. It feels a little bad, but at this point, it doesn't. It's within a reason. Soul Ring is great first 2 turns, but if it comes up turn 6, you don't really care. So, it is what it is. But yeah, I guess you're right. There's not as much fast mana. All your black tutors are usually 1 in most cases, so that's not in there. So yeah, I guess 3.6 is a little bit reasonable. Again, then this is the analysis of a budget environment. This is what we're analyzing, the fact that your average CMC across state playgroup is going to be a little bit higher than it would be in a non-budget format, I think.
Yeah. And even if you just look at the staples for each color, like take blue for example, obviously we're not going to be running like Force of Will, Force of Negation, anything like
Uh-huh.
that. That's 1 blue. We're going to be running the 2, 3, 4-drop counter spells.
Yeah,
It's
true.
just gonna drag it up a little bit more. But yeah, I think it makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, it does. I think that is a good just general point about this format is almost everything is just a +1 to the
Mhm.
card in a way in terms of mana value. Not always, and that's not an accurate thing to say, I guess, but generally speaking, you're not paying, 2 mana to draw 3 cards. You're paying 3 mana to draw 3 cards. You're not countering the spell for 2 mana, you're countering it for 3 mana. In most cases, generally. Um, so yeah, I guess our 3.16 is pretty on the money. Calamax is the lowest. I don't know this deck that well yet, but I imagine it's mostly just I don't know what makes it so low, Zach. Actually,
Mainly just because it's a ton of instants, and a lot of the cards, and it's been a long time since I constructed this deck, but thinking back, a lot of the cards are like stuff that you probably wouldn't run in other decks because it doesn't do that much. But if you can copy it, it just gets better. And it's
Okay.
running a lot of stuff like Reverberate and things like that that are just like one red or maybe one red. I can't remember, but
Reverberate's red, I think. So it's
that's
still only
okay.
two.
Yeah. But yeah, it's just running a lot of stuff like that. That's like cheap instance, and the goal is to kind of string those together to combo out.
Okay. So you're just trying to storm off so everything's really cheap, pretty
Hmm.
much.
Yep.
Okay. Rakdos over here, though, at 4.57, that's a very high CMC. And obviously, at 4.57 is the average. There's plenty of stuff at 5, 6, 7 mana. Um, if you don't know Rakdos Little Riots, his whole thing is he cheats out cards with a reduction based on how much damage your opponent's been dealt. Now, 4.57 is high, and it makes sense because you're cheating stuff out. But man, that is high thinking about that.
Yeah, and I think that is why Rakdos is not inconsistent, but maybe one of the less consistent decks in the group. Because if you can't get out like pingers and stuff that are going to be able to do that, 3 or 4 damage to be able to, get you to the point where you can play Rakdos, deal 4 damage, and discount everything by 4, and just start flooding the board with big creatures. If you can't get to that point, then you're just going to be really
Sitting
slow.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think yeah, Rakdos is a little bit inconsistent, but if things go right, it's quickly the arch enemy of the table, right?
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
and I think it's just the nature of the deck. I mean, you could argue black red decks are a little bit more volatile anyway, just by the nature of the colors together, that Rakdos identity. So yeah, I mean 4.75. Yeah, when I was looking through these, picking, I was like, oh, okay, 3.8. Oh wow, 3.9 is pretty high. Oh wow, we've broken the 4 threshold. I'm like, holy, 4.57. That is high. But again, nature of the deck is cheating stuff out. It's a volatile deck, but when it works, it hurts to be on the receiving end.
Yep.
All right, well, we have broken down the CMC. Now we're just going to jump through and go through the card types. Most play creatures, most play enchantments. You know, um, how many of each of these cards show up in the decks, and which decks have the most and the least. So I'll go ahead and just take us in with creature because I'm a green mage. I like creatures a lot, and the average number of creatures in a deck within our play group is 24.1 creatures. The highest number of creatures in any deck is, oddly enough, Rakdos, Lord of Rides at 42. And the lowest number is in Tassiger, the Golden Fang, with only 6 creatures. Among the entire play group, the most played creature is Elvish Mystic, which is a 1/1 creature elf druid for 1 green mana that says tap it, add 1 green mana to your mana pool. So yeah, I mean, what do you think about that, Zach?
I was a little surprised at the average being 24. It seems high.
I thought it was high too.
Yeah. But I guess our decks that run creatures run a lot of creatures, I think.
That's a
Or our
fair
decks that,
point.
care about creatures, I guess I should say, like uh, yeah, Omnath, Rakdos, obviously, blanket on other decks care about creatures right now. But the point is, I think a lot of them run, in like the low 30s of creatures. So I think that just drags it up because, our decks that don't specifically care about a specific card type are going to be more balanced, I think, with
Mhm.
15, 16 of each thing, maybe a little bit heavier in the one or the other. But the decks that care about creatures really care about creatures.
Yeah, that is a very good analysis. Like Rakdos 42. I know for a fact my Marin deck's like 38.
Hmm.
Azuri's like 36, 32 maybe. So yeah, the decks that care about them a lot. I think another thing is this may be another side effect of the budget format, and here's why. I think it's because you have all these cards that are just good, right? But a lot of times wizards will reprint them attached to a creature because arguably it's easier to remove. That's the argument. Oh, it's on a creature, I can kill it easily, so it's a little bit weaker being on here. So I think a lot of the times we run, and that makes them, arguably worse. So that makes them arguably cheaper in terms of like real world price. So they should find their way in our decks. And I'm talking stuff like all your, good examples of these, all the Maguses, your Magus of the Wheels. your Magus of the Moon. Like all these effects are on non-creature cards that are better, but they're made a little bit worse because they're stuck on a creature that costs a little bit more mana. It's a little bit easier to remove. So I think that is kind of the case here where I can't afford to run, X, so I'll just use X on a creature that's cheaper. So we see a little bit more creatures with the effects that would have been on an artifact or an enchantment or a sorcery spell in budget.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. I think the Megasuses are a good example too, because like obviously we're not going to be running Wheel of Fortune in budget, and even
Mm-hmm.
less premier wheel cards like Windfall's getting fairly expensive these days, and I'm sure there's some other ones that are just a few dollars and are out of budget range. So I think putting it on a creature, obviously like you're gonna have to give it haste if you want to be able to
Yeah.
do that at instant speed, because most of them are tap effects versus just paying mana. Usually like what, 2 blue tap and wheel everybody versus a windfall. So it's a little bit slower, a little bit easier to remove, like Christian said. So it just never catches on in non-budget decks and finds its way down to a much more affordable price.
Yep. Exactly. So, Rakdos of 42, we talked about that deck. It's just a lot of big, strong creatures. Tasker at 6. I don't think we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but this Tasker deck in our play group is we say it's the fun police or the control police. In it's kind of a joke, but that's also the purpose of it. It's a very politics deck. The whole point is to sit around, counter things, remove things, destroy creatures, whatever it is. It tries to be a control deck, a moderator deck until it reaches its kind of combo and wins. So 6 creatures, that's not surprising because everything is basically an instant sorcery in that deck.
Yep. Yeah, not too surprising. Like Christian said, runs a ton of sorceries. I think at least half of those creatures are combo pieces. So just doesn't run unnecessary creatures, I guess that's it.
All right. Well, that about wraps up creatures. Zach, you want to take us into sorcery?
Yep. So the average number of sorceries is 9.4. Somewhat interesting. Obviously, less than half of creatures. And the highest number of sorceries in any deck is 35 in Worth the Raid Mother, and the lowest is a 1 in Thassa Deep Dwelling. Our most popular sorcery is Rampant Growth. Obviously, we've talked about this a couple times now, but 1 green to tutor for a card, put it into the battlefield tap. Sorry, not a card, a basic land card, and put it into the battlefield tap. Uh, so that's not too surprising. Like we said, this is a really popular card in decks that contain green, and green is very played throughout our playgroup. Uh, as far as 9 being the average, I don't know what you think, Christian, but I was a little bit surprised by that. I guess just because it's low.
Yeah, I think
But
it's low too.
yeah, yeah, I think maybe maybe we favor instants more. Obviously, they're a little bit more versatile, but I was surprised just because I think in a lot of my decks, I'll find cards that maybe there's an instant version of that effect out there that's a little bit more expensive, but then you'll have a sorcery version, which obviously is slower, so I'm only going to be able to play it at sorcery speed, but is much more budget friendly. So I'll go with that over the instant speed effect.
Yeah, that's yeah. I yeah, sorcery is weird. I expected this to be a bit higher too. And to be honest, we've kind of talked about various reasons of why things are. I don't really know why this is so low necessarily. In all my years of Magic, I have no I have no idea why this is so low. I mean, obviously I'm a contributor to it, being part of the play group, but the 35 sorceries and wart, that's my deck. I guess a lot of the things I feel like copying in wart are sorcery. It's a lot of token making, lots of land tutors, burn spells that are big burn spells are mostly sorcery. So like that's why sorcery's so high in that one. A lot of instants, maybe some removal in there. That'll be copying, but yeah, I I will say maybe it's because of the blue mage ideology a lot of the people in the playgroup have. They're blue players. So uh, if it comes down like you said, you went the cheaper option. Sometimes you have 2 cards with similar effect. I guess more people might dish out the extra money to get the instant or take a week, or if it's like, this affects better technically, but it's a sorcery, maybe they'll take the slightly weaker effect because it's an instant. I'm not sure why sorcery came out at 9, and it not only like I understand sorcery being less than instant, but 9 feels really low out of 100
Yeah,
cards.
yeah. I
So,
guess
I don't
it
know.
was 10%
Yeah,
basically decks. I guess looking at it as a percentage, it kind of makes more sense. I was really surprised by Thassa only having one sorcery. I guess it just leans heavier in the instance like counter spells and stuff.
and just, bouncing creatures and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So, I did look it up because I was curious. Like we didn't write it down here, but the one sorcery in the deck is Clear the Mind, which I have to credit you with that one, Zach. I think you are the harbinger of Clear the Mind in the Playgroup being more of a staple because it's very good. It's a more recent card to have come out. I, I would say it's probably staple at this point. Maybe not. If you're playing blue, you don't automatically throw it in, but it's getting there because 3 mana to draw a card is already fine enough in terms of budget and then an effect with that, but that effect being shuffling in your whole deck, like in the decks that care to do that, it's just good. So, um,
yeah.
yeah, that's the only sorcery in Thassa, which again, it's just raw utility and it's good. I think that anything else you want to add to sorcery? That was a weird one. I feel like we didn't like actually explain it well because we don't know. This is an interesting one. Sorcery
Yeah.
is lower than we expected.
Yeah, I think maybe when we go into the other types, we'll get a fuller picture. Maybe come back to it and
Yeah.
you know have a better analysis at that point.
Yeah, so with that, I guess arguably the rival of sorcery, and not necessarily, but along with its instance, your instance sorceries always accompany one another in cards. So instance, the average number is 12.5 in our play group. The highest number is in Calamax, Stormsire at 35, which is the same number I had in Warp for sorcery. And the lowest number is one instant, and that shows up in two decks, and that is Kirkesh, Onaki Ancient, and Rakdos, Lord of Riots. Obviously, earlier we talked about the most played blue spell is Brainstorm, so most played instant obviously has to be Brainstorm. One blue for an instant, draw three cards, and put two cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. Um, what do you think, Zach? 12.5 is the average.
I was a little surprised that this was higher than the number of sorceries. I don't know, maybe it's just my deck building style. I was talked about a little bit more earlier, but I think sorceries are generally more budget friendly. But I do think there are more staples in the instant category with things like the counter spells, brainstorm, obviously, draw spells, and combine that with the fact that blue is a pretty pervasive color in our play group. I think it makes sense that the number of instances is a little bit higher.
Yeah, I agree. I think the staple factor probably does
Hmm.
come into play here a good bit.
Yeah. I'm a little bit surprised that we have two decks that only have one instant. I mean, it makes sense in Rakdos because I feel like Rakdos really is like the epitome of, pushing your game plan. It
It
just
is.
doesn't run things that aren't part of that game plan. I think it runs like one terminate. And that's about it.
It is. Yeah, it's one terminate, which is just premier, black red removal. So you kind of
Hmm.
have to, you could argue that we've talked about pushing the game plan a lot. There's a limit to doing that where at a certain point, you're just too much in the game plan. I'm not saying Rakdos is that. I guess you could argue that it is. You could argue that every deck in our playgroup is if, you're the guy who just wants to do everything, interact with everything. But
Hmm.
one instant terminate feels a little bit, you know, there's a couple more black or red instants I could see them being run or should be
Yeah.
being run, right?
Yeah.
Um, so on the low end, it's just a matter of I think player preference. The other deck, Kirkesh Onaki H and one with one instance, Ricochet Trap, which mono red that makes sense in terms of it being Ricochet Trap because it's kind of like a counter spell for red, especially in a combo deck. A mono red combo deck is going to need some way to protect itself at instant speed, and Ricochet Trap is one of the very few options, especially in budget. So that makes sense. Again, Throw Possibility is a great one that I'm surprised isn't there. So, and both these are actually the same player in our play group. Uh, so, this player obviously just likes to go pure game plan, it seems, at the expense of some instance, maybe. But, that is what it is. Instance kind of just is what it is. Has the legged staples. It's important to the deck. I also think a big thing for instant is the decks that don't have blue are probably inherently less an instant than a deck with blue.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Blue and red to a lesser extent, but definitely blue. Uh, yeah, I think beyond that, like most of the instances are probably going to be spot removal, stuff like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, in that case, I think we're pretty much clear now. So that was a little bit more of a straightforward one than sorcery. Jumping into artifact, which obviously artifacts are a big part of Commander. In our play group, in our budget environment, the average is 10.9 artifacts. The highest number of artifacts in any deck is 42, and that is Kirkesh, actually, or Naki Ancient. The lowest number is only 4, and that's in two decks, and that is in Omnath, Locus of Rage, and Marin of Clanton El Toth. The most played artifact is probably an obvious one, and that is Soul Ring. If you don't know what it does, for one generic mana, it's an artifact. You can tap it to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. What do you think, Zach?
Yep. So starting off with the average number being about 11, almost 11, I think that makes sense. If you're not in blue, your primary ramp is, or sorry, not in green, your primary ramp is probably going to be artifacts. And then
Hmm.
we have a couple decks like Urza and Kirkesh that are just going to drag that up a little bit even from there. So I think it makes sense. And then we run a lot of things. Obviously there's some staples like Commander Sphere that are in quite a few decks, Mind Stone, in a lot of decks. And then Meteor Golem, I think, is in like 7 or 8 decks. So just stuff like that. There's some utility artifact creatures that appear in a lot of decks, and then the ramp. So I think ramp probably accounts for, I don't know, 5, 6 cards in most of these decks. I would guess. Guess I don't have that figure here to actually confirm that, but that would be my suspicion. It's as far as the highest and lowest. I think it makes sense. Obviously, Kirkesh. I think we talked about this in another episode of the miniseries, but it's a artifact combo deck. Runs a ton of artifacts, obviously, and it makes sense. It's just lots of artifact synergy. Uh, Omnath and Marin are both green, so I think the lack of artifacts is probably just because they have that green ramp, so they don't rely nearly as heavily as other color combinations on the artifact ramp.
Yeah. Um, Pulling them both up. Obviously, I'm not going to go through because each of them are at 4. It's 8 whole cards to talk about, so I'm not going to do that. But um, things that show up, both of them have their signet in their respective colors, Golgari Gruul signet, and both of them have Soul Ring. So 2 in each are the same. Everything else is both of the other 2 are actually artifacts that draw cards. And then the last 2 is Trionic Resonator for Marin because that's my deck. I want to copy her effect, and then Swiftfoot Boots is the card in Omnath to protect him. So it's kind of interesting to see that the artifacts that did make it into the decks the least all do the same stuff, save one's protection, one is copying ability.
Yeah, protection's a good point. I didn't think about that when I was talking, but I think Swiftfoot Boots, thinking back to the spreadsheet, is in like a little less than half of our decks.
Dang.
Yeah. So yeah, it makes sense that kind of takes up another artifact slot. Swiftfoot Boots, and I think a lot of my decks at least run Whisper Silk Cloaks. So that's
Yeah.
another similar type effect. So that's 2 artifacts right there.
Yeah. I think in a non-budget environment, a competitive environment, artifacts is definitely higher. But I think the fact that we don't have access to like fast mana, like we talked about, automatically brings it down. Artifacts are inherently more expensive because they can go in any deck typically. So that's another reason you see them less. We can't be putting our budget into uh, these artifacts all the time. And I feel like a lot of artifacts are they show up in combos. Like Crack Clan Ironworks, your Ashnod's Altar, which is forced into like two or three of our decks, I think. All these cards are really getting expensive or are already expensive. So, I'm not surprised. I think about 11 cards, 11% of the deck at Artifact is kind of right on the money for the budget environment.
Yeah, I agree. Like you said, it'd definitely be higher outside of budget where you're going to be able to run a lot of more expensive stuff. Combo pieces like your Rings of Bright Hearth, and obviously like any deck that cares about sacrificing outside of budget is going to be able to run Ashnod's Altar.
Hmm.
It's pretty much an auto include for any kind of like sack loops or anything like that. It's just super efficient. Yeah, I think this makes sense in budget where you're not going to be running a lot of those more utility and combo artifacts that are just a little too expensive.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to add to Artifact then, Zach?
Nope, I think that's it for me.
Cool.
I'll jump into enchantments right here.
Yep.
So
Sounds good.
the average number of enchantments in our decks is 6.2 to be exact, and the highest number is 33 in Tuvasa the Sunlit, and the lowest is 0 in two decks, which is Thassa and Inala. Uh, the most played enchantment is Oblivion Ring, which is 2 and white for an enchantment. When Oblivion Ring enters the battlefield, exile another target non-land permanent. And when Oblivion Ring leaves the battlefield, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So I think 6.2 is about right. We don't have a ton of decks other than our Voltron decks that care a lot about artifacts, I don't think.
Or
Uh,
enchantments, right?
yeah, enchantments
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
artifacts, but yeah, I think like there's there's not as many staples in this category for one thing, because a lot of enchantments that we run are more uh, like game plan oriented and do
Yeah.
specific things.
Hmm. I'd agree with that.
Because there's just like such a huge range of effects, I feel like, on enchantments.
There are.
Outside of like the aura, which is a lot of auras are pretty similar, but outside of that, like utility enchantments, I guess I would call them. There's just it's a huge range of things that they could do, which personally, I think I maybe lean into enchantments heavier than other people in our play group. I was surprised that we had two decks that don't have any enchantments because,
Yeah.
like I said here, there's just so many different things you can do with enchantments, and I like, a lot of them have similar effect to say an instant of sorcery. Like Guardian Project is a huge powerhouse in a couple of my decks. Draws cards every time a creature enters the battlefield, and it's a little bit harder to remove because it's not on a creature. So like Soul of the Harvest will probably get removed before Guardian Project,
Hmm.
and it's the same type of effect. And I think they can be really powerful and stick around for a long time. So I was a little surprised we had two decks with none.
Yeah. One of those two is the same person as Kirkesh and Rakdos. That could just be a factor of super pushing the game plan. The other one, Thassa, you can't get any extra value out of the enchantments like you can from its creatures.
Mhm.
And it's probably just more game plan heavy. I guess another argument you can make is blue enchantments sometimes. I feel like blue, not necessarily blue enchantments. I mean, yes, blue enchantments, but enchantments in general, the good ones are maybe out of budget in some cases. Like I'm thinking, like your privileged position, your Sterling Groves, all those cards are insane enchantments, but they're just not budget, and that could play a factor. Um, I think another part of it is that enchantments, I guess, more enchantments are accrued value, if that makes sense. Like Guardian Project, you said is a good example. It's a little bit out of budget. It's out of budget now, kind of. But when you built
Yeah.
your Yarok deck originally, it was in budget. So we're just using that as an example. Um, it's accrued value. When you cast the card and it hits the battlefield, it doesn't do anything for you. But over time, as you lay more things, you draw cards. Yarok abuses it because it's an ETB, so it doubles, or it has a triggerable ETB, so
Mhm.
it doubles it. But a lot of these enchantments, arguably, are really slow because you get it. It costs 4 mana. You lay it. It doesn't do anything on ETB unless you're playing a enchantment deck. Probably nothing triggers when you cast it, and so until your next upkeep, if it sticks around, you might get something. Maybe you have to lay a creature like Guardian Project to get any value out of it. So I feel like enchantments, though versatile, can feel a little bit slow, and you have to play towards some of the better ones if with your deck type. Um, so yeah, enchantment is a weird one. There's just so many different factors of enchantment. And you talked about your game plan. You like enchantments. I really like enchantments too. It's probably like my second favorite card type right after creature because I just like the idea of. I mean, they really are enchantments. You just are affecting your entire board with this passive effect
Mhm.
that is just getting you value as you do things. And I really like enchantments for that.
Yeah, and I think they can be powerful. Like I think we see this a lot in Zur, obviously. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's a ton of enchantments, but once you can kind of compound the effects, I feel like, of these enchantments. Like with Zur, if he has like Astral Slide and Drift and say I forget what it's called, the one that has Ascended and makes
Oh
Drake
yeah,
Haven.
yeah,
So like
Drakehaven.
yeah, so once you get, two or three of those out, it just becomes such a powerful engine and just, if you can get those out and you can protect them, you're well on your way to winning a game, I think, in a lot of cases.
Yeah, they can be kind of like artifacts as well, where you're kind of assembling this engine.
Mhm.
Enchantments can kind of do that same thing.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that, like, on their own, Drake Haven, like, if it's just a Drake Haven, I probably don't care that much.
It doesn't do anything really.
Right. But once you get, a couple of other ones out, it really starts to compound that effect. And by then it's kind of too late because, they have this engine online, probably have some, counter spells, whatever it might be to interact with your removal and just keep those sticking around on the board and generating a ton of value for them.
Yeah, and another reason is Tuvasa has the most at 33. That's a Voltron deck. You know, I don't think there's a lot of Voltron decks in the playgroup. I don't know if that's a budget problem or what people like. I don't think a lot of people love Voltron. One of our guys really likes it a lot. Um, I used to hate Voltron. I did not like Voltron at all. It's just not something I wanted to do. I like creatures. I like hitting big, but I don't know. I didn't like Voltron. And then I built my Nazan deck, which that's another factor is that's an artifact based Voltron equipment, not enchantment. So with that in mind, had he been or had I built another Voltron deck that was, getting power off of enchantments, well, enchantments probably would have had a higher average, if not six, at least seven maybe. But these Voltron based or these enchantment based Voltron decks, that's where you could see a ton of enchantments. And those aren't necessarily the same enchantments as the passive ones that we talked about. Those are you slam it on for immediate value. Your thing is now, a two, plus two flying or something like that, right? So, even more of a reason that there's another variable in terms of, examining enchantment. Just auras are a completely different ball game than your normal enchantments.
Yep. And curses, though we don't really
Yeah.
run many. If I can only think of like one or two maybe that we actually run in the playgroup, but
Yeah, curses are a weird one. I think a lot of us in the playgroup, maybe not Zach, you can disagree, but I think a lot of us would rather do something that affects everyone than one person.
yeah, that was my problem. Like for a while, I was looking at making a Mathis Fiend Seeker Curses deck, but
Hmm.
it feels like it's so hard to finish out the game. Like if I focus on one player and they die,
Yep.
I just, what am I doing now? I've used all my curses and I've, you know, two other people here I need to kill to win this game, and no curses left to do anything to them. So it's
Exactly.
yeah, kind of a tough problem.
And
Yeah,
if you're spreading your curses, you're not doing anything either.
right, right.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
except don't do enough by themselves.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And if you're putting your curses on that guy, you're their target number one, right? They're gonna hit you because you're cursing them.
Yep.
And that's not good either. And I mean, we have some people we would say are a little bit more toxic than others in our play group, probably. But I don't, at the heart of it, I don't think, well, I'd say at least 6 out of 7 of us are not trying to hate on anyone at the table specifically. Like, I don't, if I'm attacking you, Zach, I'm a generally a good guy. I think I don't like to be hitting you. I'm trying to win the game, obviously, but if you're going off, I need to deal with you. I'm not trying to ruin your fun. I'm just trying to win, and it still doesn't feel good to do that. And that in a curse deck, it's like, wow, I'm specifically choosing to mess with you, and that doesn't always feel good as a player. I feel like.
Yeah, I think it would definitely throw off threat assessment, especially for certain players like we've talked about. It's just everybody kind of reacts differently to this kind of thing. People have different ideas of threat assessment. There might be somebody with a big built-up board, and the guy slinging curses at you, so you're going to target because he's specifically targeting you, whereas the guy with the 40 power on the board or whatever it might be is not really targeting him or is trying to kill somebody else before they get to him. Whatever the case may be, I think this just is going to draw more ire from a specific person than the other playstyles would.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Enchantments are interesting. Maybe we have a whole episode on enchantments, talk about auras and curses and everything. Because enchantments, that was a good little section there. I didn't really think we would get that involved with it, but they're an interesting card type. They really are.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I feel like we should talk about O-ring a little bit.
Yeah, I was just about to say that.
Like I was, I guess not too surprised by this, but a little bit. I don't think it won by a ton, uh, but I don't actually remember. Uh, Maybe like 8 or 9 decks ran it, but maybe more. I can't remember, like I said, but I think it's decent removal. Like I think mainly the reason people like to run O-ring is just it's a little bit harder to remove an enchantment like we've talked about versus a creature or something, and it exiles, so it's just a nice little spot removal to have, I think.
Yeah, I think this has always kind of been, at least when we started playing Magic, one of the premier
Mhm.
white cards, premier removal. So I think that kind of stuck with us as players. uh, and we just keep using it. I think some of these cards are like that. Like, Elvish Mystic was our most played creature.
Mhm.
In older players, that's probably Llanowar Elves. I mean, they're the exact same card, right? But most of us in our playgroup started playing in like Theros, and Elvish Mystic was in Standard. So when we go to the store to buy packs, you're pulling Elvish Mystics out. So I think as a card, it just stuck with us as players, and that's why, odds are if one of them makes in the deck, it's Elvish Mystic, if not both anyway. But I think that's part of it, and I think O Ring's the same. When we started playing, I heard a lot about O Ring is pretty staple and standard, so I think it's budget for one thing, but I think that is part of the reason why it still kind of has a good presence in the play group.
Yeah,
All
makes sense.
right. Anything else on O Ring?
Nope, I think that's it.
Cool. All right. Planeswalker. The average number of Planeswalker in our deck in our play group is zero point 0.3, so not even a whole Planeswalker. The highest number of Planeswalkers in any deck is 4, and that's in Atrix and Nev Twin Casters. The lowest number in a deck is 0, and that is in 29 decks. So over half the decks have not a single Planeswalker in it. The most played Planeswalker is Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, which is a legendary planeswalker Jace for 1 blue, blue, blue. And it says if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. He comes with 4 loyalty. His abilities are +1 is target player puts top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, draw a card, and his -8 is draw 7 cards. Then if your library has no cards in it, you win the game. What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, so I'm not too surprised. Honestly, I think this is probably our like least interesting section we have here, just because
Yeah.
planeswalkers, generally speaking, are just more expensive. Uh,
Hmm.
Especially ones that are in standard, like your Teferis and things like that. The effects are just a little bit too powerful, and they retain their value really well. Like,
And most are
uh,
mythic.
yeah, yeah, that too. And like, probably the most played ones that we see are like the War of the Spark, where there are just a ton of planeswalkers.
Yep.
So some of them, just kind of became chaff and got more, less expensive over time. And I think Jace makes sense. I think it might both be my decks that are running it. I think there's only 2 decks that are actually running this.
I
Uh,
think you're right. I don't
it's
know if maybe
it's
one deck that's not yours is running it.
yeah, I'm pretty sure I run it in Pure and Toothy. Actually, maybe that's it. I don't remember now, but I definitely run it in Pure and Toothy. I don't
Yeah.
remember who the other deck is, but yeah, I think it's just it's an alternate win con besides Labman. It's like I think the only other card with that effect on it besides Laboratory Maniac, where with his static effect, you just win the game if you try to draw from an empty library. So like Peer and Toothy, you can very easily deck yourself. Like I think I've probably lost as many games as I've won just by accidentally killing myself or like putting a bunch of creature or bunch of counters on Toothy and somebody kills it and I draw 40 cards and just kill myself that way. So this is just kind of lets you win instead of losing when you do that. So just a nice alternate win con.
I think yeah, this is just a slightly uninteresting section because there's not much to talk about. Again, you said War of the Spark. I think that is a big part of it. A lot of uncommon and rare planeswalkers opposed to mythic. Um, just cheaper. Arguably not as good, but planeswalkers have an inherent power with them in that they stick around, they do things consistently, they're hard to get off the table because there's not a lot of, planeswalker removal in budget. Um, they're just generally a powerful card. They're not always worth the price in budget. $10 towards a planeswalker, $8 towards a planeswalker. If you're really going to put that much towards a single card, you should probably be putting it to something that's just insane for your game plan. I mean, maybe that is a planeswalker, but odds are it's more of like a win con or just something that is a staple in this type of deck. It just kind of is what it is. I mean, I will say this. I think maybe not Zach, but I think more decks would have had planeswalkers in them if we started playing in this format closer to when War of the Spark came out.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it is kind of ingrained in us at this point that like planeswalkers are expensive. Like personally, I don't spend that much time looking at planeswalkers when I
Me
build a
either.
deck, just because, I'll look and see, oh man, this planeswalker just based on the effects without knowing the price is super good for this deck, and I'll look at it and it's, 5, 10, $15, and it's just I can't justify paying that for this card because while it might be good, it's probably not going to win me the game, and that's generally reserve those higher cost cards for things that are going to win the game.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of our decks, like I said, are older before War of the Spark. So if we were going to add a War of the Spark Planeswalker, we have to take something out. Whereas if we were building these decks post War of the Spark, something might have just made it in anyway. Um,
Yeah, and
Part of
also
it's probably
like
timing.
yeah, yeah. Also like the cards that let you abuse planeswalkers are generally not budget stuff like Chain Veil.
Chain Veil. Yep.
Is just super expensive. Things like 50, $60, something like that, maybe even
Yep.
more. I don't remember,
Doubling
but
season.
yeah. And like obviously it's just we're never gonna see, at least not, unless there's a couple more sets like War of the Spark, we're just never gonna see like budget super friends or anything like that.
Yeah, no.
That's not really possible because for one thing you probably want to go like 4 or 5 color for that, which we have 0 4 or 5 colored decks in our budget play
Hmm.
group right now. And like I said, they're just not abusable. Planeswalkers are expensive, so it's just one of those things that's not quite possible in budget, which I think we're all pretty much fine with.
Yeah. The Out of all the decks that do have planeswalkers, I think you, me, and one or two other people run them. I think three people don't have a single deck with planeswalkers. Um, the deck that has the most is Atrix and Nev. Twin Casters at four. All the planeswalkers that deck is running are planeswalkers that are on the cheaper end. I think two or three are War of the Spark, maybe just two. They're on the cheaper end, but they are planeswalkers that plus up to produce tokens or inherently produce tokens, which, in Atrix and Ev, that makes sense. It's going to double all of them. Um, and I believe some of their alts are, make. I think one of the planeswalkers that's running is the Garuk that makes a 6/6 worm for each land. So it would copy that and, give you like 30 worms at 6/6. That's a win con right there. So that's reasonable to run it in the deck at whatever price it is, which I think he's like $5. So that's that I think is reasonable, right? $5 for a win con. And on a planeswalker, that's already good. So, if the deck calls for it, it calls for it. But in most cases, it's probably out of the price range that we're looking for.
Yeah. I think the other interesting thing about planeswalkers too, or maybe why they're not run as much, is because like when I look at a planeswalker, you see that kind of ultimate ability, neg 7, neg 8, whatever it might be, and it's like, this is really cool, and will probably win me the game, but
Are you
what
ever
are
going to get
the,
there?
yeah, exactly, what are the
Yep.
odds that I ever get to use it? Yeah,
I knew you were going to say that because that's what I think. I almost discount the alt a
yeah,
lot of times
yeah,
when I'm looking at planeswalkers because I think our play group, because generally they have generally good, we all have generally good threat assessment. I don't think anyone's going to let you get there
right,
if they can help it.
yep. And
So
if you're in a position to do that, you're probably winning the game anyway. I think in most cases, unless you're somehow like proliferating counters onto it or something like that, And again, that's unlikely. I think just because we don't, like I said, there's not a ton of things that are going to be able to abuse that, planeswalker counter system and get you there in like, one turn really quickly,
yeah,
where people wouldn't see kind of that build up.
exactly. Yeah. It's just a lot of time needs to pass for you to do it and to keep it around that long and someone to actually let it happen. It's a lot to make work.
Yep.
All right. Well, with that complete, we have one type left. That's land. Zach, you want to kick that off?
Yep. So the average number of lands in our decks is 35.6. The highest number of lands is 39 in Corvold Faker's King, and the lowest number is 33 in Calamax the Stormsire. And our most played land is Evolving Wilds, which is a land. It's common. Tap, sacrifice Evolving Wilds, search your library for base clan card, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. Uh, so Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, which is basically the exact same card, are definitely staples in our format. I think they're running just about every deck. Just good color fixing, deck thinning, all that kind of good stuff. It's nothing broken, but good enough to be run very widely throughout the play group.
Yeah, they are just staples. They're just good. I mean, I don't know how much these cards come up in competitive, but I still don't think they're bad. I mean, you
Yeah,
can get any basic you want out for nothing. Just it enters tapped, sure, but odds
yeah,
are you probably most decks, depending on what type of deck, what archetype, colors, you probably don't have the turn one play anyway, unless it's like a mana dork or something or a soul ring you happen to get. So you feel fine laying this turn one, cracking it for whatever you need, and then having it untapped going into turn two. So
yep,
it's good.
yeah. I think maybe this used to see more competitive play. I don't play much competitive, but Fabled Passage came out in Eldraine, and
True.
it's the same thing except the land comes in untapped. I think so. Yeah, that's probably going to see a lot more competitive play than this. I think, but
Yeah. I
yeah,
well, there's also the prismatic vista
yeah,
that
yeah,
came out in Modern Horizons 1. It's the same exact card except you pay a life to do it as well as tapping it and it enters untapped. So
right,
that's also just a kind of replacement in competitive, I'd imagine.
yeah. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not. I guess it's a little interesting that I have 39 lands in Corvold. I don't remember what led me to that point, but it's a little bit interesting that there's that many in there. And then Calamax, not too surprising. I think I was really just focused on getting a ton of instants in there and really kind of pushing the game plan with that. He does have quite a bit of ramp, so uh, really focusing on like tutoring for those lands, and a lot of those effects are copyable. So I think I was just less worried about the number of lands versus being able to actually pull those out of the deck.
Yeah, plus like we talked about his lowest CMC at 2.57.
Mm,
So, you just don't need as much land because nothing costs anything.
yep.
Um, Average at 35.6. I think that is right on the like that is exact because I think the average number of lands in a commander deck from the get go, I think most people say is 36, if not 38, but 36. You throw in some blue green decks in there, and the ramp knocks you down to say like 35, 34 lands. I think 35.6 is just, you know, if it was anything else, I'd be confused.
Yep.
So, not much to say about land. Land is just land. We still wanted to just specify the staple card for the format as Evolving Wilds. Um, and I guess, this kind of proves that the rule of thumb is 36 base or 36 lands in a deck. It stayed true here, even in budget. So, yeah, I mean, that's just is what it is for land.
Yeah. And I think, obviously this is the last card type we're going over, but I think this kind of makes sense, in context of everything else we've gone over. And I don't know if you had anything else to say about land, Christian. Stop me if you do. But I was thinking more about the sorcery stuff we were talking about earlier. I think like looking at all of these really makes more sense now because, like we've talked about, I think people tend to go in more heavily on certain card types in our format versus the non-budget format, like with creatures. Obviously, we have a lot of decks that if they care about creatures, they're going to run a ton of creatures. But it's the same thing with other types, I think, especially like instants uh, and enchantments to a slightly lesser extent, where if you care about those, you're going to run a lot of them. And I think that kind of explains sorceries. Uh, just because like there's not there's a couple sorceries that are you know part of like the ramp suite and stuff like that. But outside of that, I feel like there's not a ton of staple sorceries that we run. And I think, that's just why we tend to have less of them. Like, I'll run, uh, if I'm running a Sultai deck, I'll usually run the stuff that I think is good flavor for those. Like, what's the name of the spell that's like X and Sultai and you can cast it? And
Villainous Wealth.
yes, Villainous Wealth. I'll usually run stuff like Villainous Wealth if I'm in those colors, but outside of that, uh, there's probably not that many sorceries that are like, something I would think to include without looking at it and finding the synergy with that specific commander.
Right. Yeah. You and I have talked about this. I don't know if it's been on the podcast before. Maybe it came up once, but if you're in a three-color deck and there's a card that exists that is all three of those colors, Zach and I at least are more inclined to try to get that card in there because unless you're playing five color or something, there's no other scenario where you can run this card. So you might as well make use of it when you can. Unless you're building exclusively Jeskai decks your entire life, you're probably not going to get the chance to run Jeskai Ascendancy again. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where it's, well, I'm in these colors. I can't use this card any other time. I'm going to use it now if it makes sense to. And that's kind of what Zach was saying with Villainous Wealth, where if you're in Sultai, it doesn't always hurt to throw it in because you can't do it any other day.
Yep.
Yeah, I think just overall, everything we talked about today, there's so many variables. We talk about for just enchantment alone, and that applies to just everything we see and talk about. When we started playing, the formats we like, the type of players we have, all of these come together to create this play group that we're in, and the meta of it. And we kind of talked about the meta of it uh last episode with the archetypes. Is there anything else, with all these cards you talked about, Zach, that kind of you want to say anything about the meta after looking at this?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you kind of combine like I don't know, we kind of talked about each of these cards in a vacuum a little bit. But I think if you combine a lot of the cards we've talked about today, you get a pretty good picture of the meta. Like, if you look at the different color combinations we run as well as the most popular cards for those colors, you can kind of see, what we're really doing as far as, we like to ramp a lot. We're not running a ton of fast mana, but maybe run a lot of artifacts and stuff like that. We're running a lot of draw spells. And I think maybe the thing that you don't see in this breakdown is like the deck specific things. Like win cons maybe because obviously they differ from deck to deck. But I think
Right.
overall, you're seeing a lot of the staples of our format here, and you can kind of deduce from this that like, if there's similar cards to these, they're probably being run a lot. So I think, overall this gives a pretty good picture.
Yeah, I'd agree. You don't see those archetype strong or commander specific cards coming up, which, obviously you're not gonna because every deck's different unless they're trying to do the same thing. So, yeah, I think this did just pick out some staples, which is kind of a cool thing to do. Uh, yeah, beyond that, I mean, every playgroup's gonna be different. I still think odds are this is probably a good core, statistics wise, a good expectation for most, if not the middling of a playgroup. If a playgroup, like I said, more red mages, you might get skewed a little bit less blue, a little bit more red, maybe a little bit more green in there, a little bit less black, um, stuff like that. But generally speaking, this is probably, like I said, a pretty vanilla playgroup. I don't think any of our friends are just out there in terms of things they like.
Yeah, and I don't think like we've said a few times, I think our decks are pretty tuned. Like there's not a deck I can think of that's just, kind of like a jank theme deck that's just
Right.
the goal isn't really to win, but to just do fun stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with that kind of deck, but it's just not the kind of deck that people build in our playgroup. So I think all of
Yeah,
these are
everyone's
pretty
trying to
on target.
win.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think we'll see more of those kind of win con cards when we go into deck techs and stuff like that, which is something we want to do in the near future. So I think this just sets a nice background for that. You can keep this in the back of your mind when you listen to our deck techs, and you know you'll kind of see how this plays out in practice in an actual list.
Exactly. Yeah, that was one of the main things. Zach kind of brought this episode specifically to the table, and from this it expanded to this mini series, and all of it was in preparation for future deck techs. Just to give a nice foundation for everything you can expect. Because we're going to talk about the commander, we're going to talk about the deck, we're going to talk about how it fits into the play group and all those different things during the deck tech. So yeah, this is a good basis for all of that. Beyond that, Zach, anything else you want to add before we close it out?
No, I think that's it for me. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Yep. And if you enjoyed listening, make sure to subscribe and like the video. If you want to see anytime that we're posting news or newest episode, you can follow us on Twitter or join our Discord. Both of those are in the description below. Again, thanks for listening. We appreciate it. Share the video if you enjoyed it. We're always looking to grow. You can expect deck techs coming out real soon since this episode is finished up. Our D&D Adventures in Forgotten Realms set review will be coming out soon. Thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.